Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about something suspiciously juicy, dangerously red, and, if you were living in 18th century Europe, possibly deadly. You're standing in the flickering glow of a chandelier-lit dining hall, surrounded by powdered wigs, stiff lace collars, and silver forks that look like they could stab more than just roast beef. The table is heavy with dishes, boiled eels, baked swan, some oddly gray soup, and there, right at the center, is a bowl of sliced tomatoes. Vibrant, plump, glossy, and untouched. You glance around. Not a single guest is reaching for them. Not even the servants, who'll normally sneak a bite of anything the moment backs are turned. In fact, a few guests are side-eyeing the tomatoes like they might crawl off the plate and whisper Latin curses. Someone mutters, "Devil's apple." Another snorts and calls it a dead man's peach. You're starting to get the distinct impression that this isn't just picky eating. This is fear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and what time you're tuning in. I'm always curious to see who's relaxing with some historical weirdness at 2 a.m. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a seat near the end of the table, trying not to crinkle your silk coat too loudly. A footman pours you a glass of wine, and your eye keeps drifting back to the tomatoes. No one dares eat them, and yet, someone placed them there. Someone thought they looked beautiful enough to include in this otherwise fearfully curated feast. They glisten under candlelight, red like rubies, or fresh blood. Here's the thing. In the 1700s, the tomato wasn't a kitchen staple. It was a dangerous novelty. Imported from the New World just a couple of centuries earlier, it still hadn't shaken its exotic reputation. Some thought it was a fruit. Others thought it was poison. And many were certain it was both. Honestly, if TikTok had existed back then, tomatoes would have been the weird herbal cleanse nobody swallowed. Historians still argue whether the average European really feared tomatoes or simply misunderstood them. But you're sitting in this imaginary dining room for a reason. You're here to experience what it felt like to encounter something so ordinary to us, so benign, and see it through the eyes of people who thought it could drop you dead faster than you could say, "Pass the salt." The tomato was red, yes, but also socially red-flagged. It shared its family tree with plants like belladonna and mandrake, things people associated with witches, madness, and that one relative who always carried a pouch of dried herbs for protection. Combine that with a slippery texture, seeds that looked suspiciously like internal organs, and a flavor some called sinful, and you had a recipe for anxiety on a silver platter. You lean forward a little, listening to the gentry chatter about war debts and the latest scandal involving a duke's runaway horse. Then the conversation shifts, softly but unmistakably, to food. Someone across the table mentions a gardener in Sussex who died shortly after eating tomato pie. Another swears his aunt's rash started right after adding tomato to her broth. One man, half drunk on claret, whispers that he once saw a tomato twitch on the vine. You smile politely, but okay, maybe you're twitching too now. One actual reason tomatoes got such a bad rap among the upper classes? Pewter. The kind of soft metal used in elite dishware contained lead. Tomatoes are highly acidic. Put the two together and you've got a fast track to lead poisoning. Of course, nobody in 1760 understood chemical interactions quite like that. All they saw was, "I ate a tomato and felt like death. Therefore, tomatoes are the problem." Classic scientific method, right? Even worse, the tomato's skin was too shiny, too smooth. It didn't brown or wilt like trustworthy vegetables. It just sat there, red and proud and frankly a little smug. Imagine trying to eat something that looks like it should be in a haunted still life painting. It's a tomato, sure, but you're not convinced it won't whisper your time has come when you sink your fork into it. And yet, someone must have grown that tomato, cared for it, picked it. Which means that even in this sea of suspicion, there were outliers. Quiet gardeners. Risk-tolerant cooks. Some might even say rebels. But we'll get to them later. For now, back at your seat, the tomato dish remains full. Guests laugh, sip wine, and avoid eye contact with the fruit like it owes them money. And you can't help but wonder, what would have happened if you took a bite? Would the footman rush in? Would a physician burst through the window with a jar of leeches and a portable fainting couch? Or would you just chew? Swallow? Blink? Maybe your stomach would rumble a little, but only because of the mutton. You reach for your fork, heart fluttering just enough to make you question your life choices. But before you pierce that glossy red skin, the hostess claps twice. Dessert is served, candied figs and a rather safe-looking trifle. Everyone applauds. The tomato survives another meal uneaten, unloved, but noticed. As you rise to leave, a servant clears the plates. The tomato bowl is the only one left untouched. He scoops them into a wooden bucket, probably for compost. Or maybe you think they'll go back to the garden to be replanted. Or just possibly they'll be eaten by someone braver than you. You step out into the cool night air, the scent of beeswax candles still clinging to your clothes. The cobblestone crunches softly beneath your shoes as you make your way through the side garden, past hedges trimmed like chess pieces and flower beds arranged with military precision. You spot a servant disappearing around the corner, carrying that same wooden bucket filled with the untouched tomatoes. He hums tunelessly, clearly not in mortal fear of what he's carrying. You follow, discreetly of course. He rounds a corner near the stables and dumps the bucket behind a low stone wall, not in a compost pile as you expected, but in a heap of discarded food scraps and broken pewter dishes. A strange place to toss perfectly good fruit, you think, but then you spot something even stranger. Several of the pewter plates are blackened and warped, as though something acidic has corroded them. You crouch closer. One of the plates has a half-eaten tomato slice still stuck to it, as if someone got halfway through a bite and panicked. The metal around the slice looks unhealthy, pitted, tarnished. And there it is, your first real clue in this culinary murder mystery. You see, in the 1700s, the upper crust of society dined off plates made of pewter, a soft metal alloy that, unfortunately, often contained lead. Harmless enough for dry foods, but tomatoes? Tomatoes are highly acidic, and acid plus lead equals a slow, agonizing slide into full-body disaster. Think stomach cramps, hair loss, tremors, personality changes. You start acting like you've spent one too many summers licking paint. Historians still argue whether tomato-based lead poisoning was widespread or just a handful of tragic dinner parties. But the association stuck. People began to notice. Every time tomatoes graced a noble's table, someone got violently ill. The rich began to whisper. Tomatoes are cursed, they'd say. Leave them for the peasants. Not exactly the PR campaign the tomato needed. Meanwhile, those peasants? They didn't have pewter plates. They ate off of wood or earthenware, simple, porous, and totally lead-free. Some of them grew tomatoes in modest gardens, slicing them into stews or baking them into pies without incident. But their experience didn't matter much to the social elite. If Lady Glastonbury's hairdresser collapsed after a spoonful of tomato soup, that's what got remembered. As you straighten up from your crouch, brushing the dirt off your coat, you wonder how many of those warped pewter plates became scapegoats for a fruit that never stood a chance. And honestly, blaming the dinnerware sounds like a solid excuse for a lot of things. Spilled wine, slippery goblet, social faux pas, faulty fork. You continue down the path toward the servant quarters, lantern flickering as moths spiral lazily through the darkness. You imagine a scenario, a wealthy family hosting a summer feast, tomatoes served in abundance, laughter echoing through the hedges, and by morning, 3 guests are bedridden with stomach agony. Doctors scratch their heads. Servants whisper about witchcraft. A local priest suggests divine punishment for vanity. No one thinks to check the plates. But let's not give 18th century Europeans too much grief. They weren't totally off base. Lead poisoning was a thing. And tomatoes are acidic. If you were connecting dots in 1765 with no internet, no science textbooks, and a strong fear of anything redder than a boiled beet, you'd probably jump to the same conclusion. And speaking of red, remember that in this period color wasn't just an aesthetic, it was a message. Red was the color of danger, of forbidden lust, of sin. Red garments were bold, even scandalous. Red foods were often treated with suspicion, as if they'd been dipped in witchcraft before hitting the market stall. The tomato didn't just look different, it felt different, like it wasn't trying to blend in. As you reach the edge of the garden, you spot another figure, an elderly kitchen boy, sorting vegetables under the light of a single oil lamp. You approach quietly. He's slicing carrots, shucking peas. And right there beside him is a small basket of tomatoes. Not centerpieces. Not decoration. Just part of the mix. He notices your glance and smiles, missing 3 teeth but otherwise cheerful. Cook uses M sometimes, he says, shrugging. Says the gentry don't know good taste from chimney ash. You chuckle. And just like that, another piece of the puzzle slips into place. The cooks, the unsung alchemists of every manor and chateau, had a different relationship with food. They weren't as caught up in trends or social fears. They went by smell, taste, what made the stew thicker or the sauce brighter. And if a tomato helped do that, well, they'd risk a little table gossip. Still, you wonder how many cooks had to sneak those tomatoes in. Maybe puree them into something anonymous. Maybe call it Spanish fruit relish, to avoid suspicion. Because even if the tomato wasn't killing anyone directly, the idea of it could ruin a career. You thank the boy, continue back toward the manor, and your mind drifts. Tomatoes. Pewter. Class divides. Culinary fearmongering. You start to wonder, what else in your pantry has a dark past? What other innocent foods were once accused of murder? But tonight it's the tomato's turn. And as the moon rises over the garden, silver and sleepy, you glance back one more time. The tomatoes gleam softly in the basket, harmless, quiet, and just a little misunderstood. The next morning you wake early, birdsong creeping in through the manor's tall windows. The air smells faintly of damp linen and cold ashes, the remnants of last night's fire still nestled in the hearth. Downstairs, breakfast is being laid out. Brown bread, soft cheese, maybe a little boiled egg if the chickens were in a cooperative mood. But no tomatoes. Never tomatoes. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders and slip out toward the kitchen gardens, the ones tucked behind the stables where the real culinary action begins. Here the soil is dark and rich, steam rising in tendrils as the morning sun gently warms the earth. Dew clings to the leaves of herb bushes, thyme, sage, maybe even some lavender. A few hens peck lazily at the ground near the fence. And tucked into a far corner, hemmed in by marigolds and rosemary, are the tomato vines. They're surprisingly beautiful. Not wild or sinister as the dinner table gossip might suggest, but orderly and almost architectural. Vines curling with intention. Leaves like flattened parsley. And the fruits themselves, ripe, heavy, dripping with color. You reach out to touch one and it yields slightly under your finger. Warm, alive. This is the contradiction of the 18th century tomato. Feared in parlors but quietly cultivated in gardens. Outlawed in polite conversation, yet grown in noble estates under a different name. You see, it wasn't always called tomato. It had many aliases. Love apple, wolf peach, even golden apple, if the variety happened to be yellow. Some names made it sound romantic. Others made it sound dangerous. But the goal was always the same. Keep its identity just slippery enough to avoid direct blame. Historians still argue whether tomatoes were ever truly outlawed in Europe or just avoided through social pressure. But it's clear that by the 1700s, they occupied a strange culinary limbo. Too exotic for daily use, too notorious for elite menus, yet too enticing to ignore. It was the fruit equivalent of a scandalous letter you shouldn't read, but do by candlelight when no one's watching. And the name wolf peach? That one has a particularly juicy backstory. It comes from German folklore and botany, Lycopersicum esculentum, literally wolf peach, thanks to the tomato's resemblance to deadly nightshade, a plant known for causing hallucinations, madness, and the occasional oops my heart stopped. In other words, if you grew up hearing that witches use similar berries to summon spirits or assassinate barons, you'd probably side-eye the tomato too. You pluck one from the vine, feeling almost criminal. In fact, in some parts of Europe at the time, people did believe tomatoes could incite lust. The name love apple wasn't just poetic, it hinted at aphrodisiac properties. There were rumors that women who ate tomatoes grew bold, talkative, maybe even rebellious. Men meanwhile became passionate and restless. You take a bite. It's tart, juicy, and slightly grassy. Your pulse stays normal. No sudden desire to recite poetry. A shame. You glance up and catch the gardener watching you from a few rows over. He nods approvingly and points toward a small bundle of leaves tied with string. For sauce, he says. Cook makes it for the Italians. Ah yes, the Italians. In the 1700s they were way ahead of the tomato game. While Northern Europe tiptoed around the fruit, parts of Italy, especially Naples and Sicily, embraced it like a long-lost cousin. They roasted it, stewed it, even squashed it onto flatbread long before pizza became a global icon. To them the tomato wasn't a threat. It was dinner. But even in Italy it took time. The earliest written recipes using tomatoes didn't appear until the late 1600s. Before that, even Italian cooks eyed the tomato with caution. It was new after all. Foreign. Possibly hallucinogenic. And for a society deeply rooted in tradition, that was enough to raise eyebrows. Still, by the mid-1700s, tomato use in Italian cuisine was growing fast, especially among the lower classes. They didn't have fancy plates to corrode, or powdered wigs to protect. They had fire, bread, and hunger. And the tomato delivered. You squat beside the gardener as he checks for worms in a row of green beans. His hands are gnarled, sun-darkened, quick. You ask him, why grow tomatoes if most of the household won't eat them? He chuckles, wiping his hands on his apron. They say it's poison, he says, but only if you're rich enough to believe it. And that's the thing, isn't it? So much of food history is shaped not by science but by class. The tomato wasn't just a misunderstood fruit, it was a symbol. Of foreignness. Of risk. Of peasantry. In some circles, admitting you liked tomatoes was like admitting you used garlic or danced barefoot. Delightful, yes. But not respectable. You walk back toward the kitchen, basket in hand. The cook is stirring a pot of something aromatic, maybe fish stew or lentil porridge. You hand her the tomatoes and she thanks you with a wink, slipping one into the pot when she thinks no one's looking. A few feet away, a footman drops a silver tray. The clang echoes across the tiles and someone curses under their breath. Everyone's eyes dart to the kitchen door, half expecting a noble to burst in, demanding explanations. But the cook just keeps stirring. The tomato, once feared, is already making its quiet return. You slip out of the kitchen as the cook hums a low tune, spoon clinking gently against the pot. The air outside is warmer now, the late morning sun casting long, lazy beams over the gravel paths. Somewhere in the orchard, a dog barks twice and then gives up, presumably distracted by a squirrel or his own tail. You make your way toward the manor's library, not for a book exactly but for something even juicier, gossip in print. Libraries in 18th century Europe weren't just hushed tombs of knowledge. They were part curiosity shop, part cabinet of paranoia. One shelf might contain poetry, the next a treatise on spontaneous combustion. And among the leather-bound volumes and worm-eaten atlases, you find what you're looking for. A dusty hand-copied collection of medical theories by one Dr. John Gerard, esteemed English botanist and proud tomato skeptic. You lower the heavy book onto a table and flip to the page in question. And there it is in glorious ink. The tomato, being of a rank and stinking savor, is not to be eaten. You raise an eyebrow. Stinking savor, huh? You've smelled worse in a medieval cheese cellar. But Gerard wasn't alone in this view. Many botanists and physicians of the era warned against eating tomatoes, not because they were poisonous, but because they were probably unnatural. Which, for the 1700s, was more than enough reason. You flip another page. A scribbled margin note reads, said to cause melancholy vapors and internal bile heating. Lovely. Nothing like a fruit that boils your mood and sours your stomach. Historians still argue whether these warnings were based on actual reactions or simply extrapolated from the tomato's appearance and its botanical relatives. After all, it belonged to the Solanaceae family, aka the nightshades. And that group included some infamous party crashers like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. You glance out the window as you imagine a dinner guest, circa 1740, being offered a salad with tomato slices. The man recoils in horror. You mean to ingest it? He huffs as if you just offered him a spoonful of mercury. Another guest might whisper, I heard it can heat the blood and twist the mind. Suddenly, the tomato isn't a garnish, it's a psychological landmine. You remember too that during this time, medicine was deeply influenced by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Everything you ate was believed to affect your inner balance. Was the tomato hot or cold? Dry or moist? Some argued it was too moist and too cold, perfect for inciting laziness or melancholia. Others claimed it was hot and dry, making it more likely to stir up aggression or lust. No one could agree. Which sounds about right for pre-modern medicine. There's even an account, fringe but amusing, of a London apothecary who allegedly advised his clients to carry a tomato in their pocket to ward off indigestion, but never to slice it. Because slicing released the bitter ghosts. Ghosts. You'd think the tomato had joined a seance instead of a salad. The idea that food could carry spiritual or emotional effects wasn't new. Garlic, after all, was both food and talisman. But the tomato existed on an uncomfortable border between the known and the otherworldly. It wasn't native to Europe. It had no clear medicinal use. And it came in bright, almost theatrical colors. What else would it be if not suspicious? You set the book aside and walk toward the drawing room, where a few members of the household are playing cards. One of them, a young lady in embroidered slippers, notices your thoughtful frown. Reading again? She asks, sipping from a porcelain cup. You nod, sliding into a chair. Just learning why tomatoes were once accused of summoning spirits and boiling bile. She laughs, but it's the nervous kind. The kind that says, I know this is nonsense, but please don't put one on my plate. You glance at the tea tray. Cucumber sandwiches. Plum tartlets. And a bowl of small peeled apples. Not a tomato in sight. And not in tea. I've heard they're used in witch brews, she says, twirling a ring on her finger. In the colonies, I mean. Ah, the colonies. Another thorny vine in the tomato's tail. By the 1700s, The tomato had begun to make more of a name for itself in the Americas, particularly in the Spanish and Portuguese territories. But even there, its reputation wasn't entirely clean. Some native groups treated it with caution. Others embraced it. And settlers often picked up both the usage and the suspicion, depending on who their neighbors were. The Spanish had introduced the tomato to Europe in the 1500s, but even in Spain, it didn't catch on immediately. It was used more as an ornamental plant at first, loved for its decorative vines and curious fruit, not for its culinary potential. In some grand homes, tomatoes were placed on windowsills as conversation pieces, like exotic parrots you didn't dare pet. You wonder how many tomatoes sat there, untouched for years, admired but feared. Like forbidden knowledge. Or a book you were too superstitious to open. Back in the drawing room, a game of whist has begun. The young lady fans her cards, murmuring something about tomato red fabric being bad luck at weddings. You file that one away. Another odd superstition. Another little fear was pinned to the tomato's cap. You excuse yourself, heading upstairs again, this time toward the attic. The house is old and you're sure it has secrets. You climb past the faded portraits, the creaky steps, until you reach a wooden door with a rusted handle. Inside it smells like dust and linen and long-forgotten perfume. And in the corner, under a cracked window pane, sits a crate of old recipe books. You pull one out at random. The script is spidery. The ink faded. But you recognize the word immediately. Pomodoro. Italian for tomato. The recipe is for a sauce. Garlic, basil, olive oil, and the star ingredient, sliced thin and stewed low over the fire. A secret recipe, perhaps, hidden in a noble's attic for fear of what others might say. You sit on the floor, book in your lap, dust motes dancing in the sunbeam. It's quiet. Safe. The fear feels far away now. Just you and a tomato sauce that someone once hid like a scandal. And somehow that makes it all the more delicious. You stay in the attic a while longer, your fingertips dusted in fine gray powder and old ink, the recipe still open in your lap. There's something oddly comforting about knowing someone, perhaps a cook, perhaps a noblewoman with rebellious taste, felt strongly enough about tomato sauce to write it down in secret. It's a quiet defiance, the kind that simmers instead of shouts. Eventually, you make your way downstairs again, past the oil portraits that eye you as if they know you've stumbled onto a culinary scandal. The house is still, but you hear soft movement in the parlor, a servant dusting perhaps. You slip into the hallway and find yourself once again in front of the conservatory doors. There's something about returning to the tomato plants themselves that feels necessary, almost like a confrontation. Inside the glassy enclosure, the air is warm and sticky, heavy with the scent of soil and leaves. The tomato vines are thriving. Thick and bushy, their fruits range from pale yellow to a ruddy crimson that almost glows. You run your fingers along the rough stalks, then hover your hand over one of the larger tomatoes. You imagine trying to serve this at a dinner party here in 1742. It wouldn't go well. You're fairly certain the butler would clutch his pearls, if butlers wore pearls, and the hostess would quietly order the kitchen scrubbed from top to bottom, just in case. That fear wasn't entirely unfounded, of course. At this point in history, many Europeans were convinced tomatoes were not just suspicious, but outright dangerous. The reason? Pewter. Yes, pewter, the silvery, soft metal used in plates, cutlery and fancy goblets. The problem was that pewter contained lead. And when acidic foods, like, say, tomatoes, were placed on pewter, the acid would leach lead from the metal. So if you were dining off pewter and happened to indulge in a tomato-laden dish, you might soon find yourself battling nausea, cramps, or worse. Not because of the tomato, mind you, but because of the plate. Historians still argue whether this connection between tomatoes and pewter was broadly understood or simply suspected by the unlucky few who keeled over after a salad. Either way, the pattern stuck. People got sick after eating tomatoes and they blamed the fruit, not the tableware. You pluck a small, underripe tomato from a low-hanging branch and roll it between your fingers. You try to picture the exact moment someone realized the dish, not the fruit, was the real villain. Maybe it never happened cleanly. Maybe the fear just faded slowly, replaced by other obsessions like powdered wigs or decorative snuff boxes. The tomato in that way was a victim of bad PR and bad timing. It was exotic, misunderstood, and served on materials that, quite literally, turned toxic under its touch. You wander over to a small wooden bench and sit. Outside, you can hear the muffled clatter of a carriage passing by. Inside, the tomatoes grow on, blissfully unaware of their centuries-long smear campaign. Another little-known cause for tomato suspicion came from their tendency to spoil quickly. Before refrigeration, A soft tomato could become a breeding ground for bacteria in a matter of hours. And because they were often stored in cellars or hot kitchens, tomatoes went from fresh to fermented nightmare faster than a nobleman could powder his wig. Naturally, some people assumed that it wasn't the bacteria causing illness, it was the tomato itself. Convenient. In one fringe case, you recall reading about a Paris household in the 1730s that supposedly banned tomatoes after a maid fell ill. The woman, it turns out, had simply eaten a moldy tomato, but the lady of the house, deciding this was proof of poison, threw out the entire basket and reportedly buried it in the garden under moonlight. You can't make this stuff up. Well, you can, but the 18th century often beat you to it. You stretch your legs and wander back into the manor. Down one hall you hear someone practicing the harpsichord. A soft, methodical plinking. Like a lullaby for the paranoid. You pass a small dining nook with lace curtains and a bowl of green pears. No tomatoes. As you round the corner toward the main staircase, you pass a servant boy carrying a bucket of soap and water. He's muttering something under his breath, something about not trusting red things that bleed without dying. You blink. Did he just reference a tomato? You follow at a safe distance and watch him empty the bucket out the side door, still grumbling. It seems the superstition runs deep here. You can't help but smile. Imagine explaining ketchup to him. Back in the drawing room, the young lady from earlier is reading a novel by candlelight. You ease into a chair nearby and say, "So, pewter plates. Ever think they're the real culprit?" She raises an eyebrow but doesn't look up. Plates don't have seeds. Tomatoes do. Therefore, tomatoes are plotting something. She flips a page. Everyone knows that. You're not sure if she's joking, and honestly you're too sleepy to care. You let your eyes close for a moment. Let the creak of the wooden floor, the tick of the grandfather clock, and the faint tomato scent from the conservatory wash over you like a warm breeze. A tomato wasn't just food. It was a symbol. Of mystery. Of foreignness. Of something that didn't quite belong but refused to leave. You drift in and out of daydreams. Somewhere in your mind, pewter plates are hissing. Tomatoes are staging a quiet rebellion. A cook is whispering, "Just one slice, no one will know." And in the corner, a single plump tomato sits on a lace doily, smug and unbothered. You wake slowly, if you were even asleep at all, one of those drowsy, fog-drenched half-naps where your mind plays historical dress-up and forgets to tell you what's real. You're still in the manor's drawing room, the young lady now gone, her book folded neatly on the cushion. Outside the tall window, early evening stretches long golden fingers across the hedgerows. You wander back toward the great hall, footsteps muffled by thick carpets woven in swirling patterns, each loop echoing with stories long since softened by time. You pause at a grand oil painting on the wall. A plump gentleman with rosy cheeks, a powdered wig that could house a family of birds, and a look of faint dismay painted forever across his face. You head toward the small writing room tucked beside the main staircase. Inside, a large mahogany desk, a squeaky quill, and exactly the sort of suspicious-looking journal one might use to record one's anti-tomato manifestos. You sit, crack open the cover, and begin to read. Turns out, in certain corners of Europe, particularly among the upper classes, tomatoes were widely considered a dangerous indulgence. They were thought to heat the blood, overexcite the stomach, and lead to all sorts of undesirable behaviors. Gluttony, laziness, even red-hued melancholy. One doctor in Vienna declared that excessive tomato consumption might encourage the humors to riot. Yes, riotous humors. You can't make this up. Historians still argue whether these warnings were born of sincere concern or something more political. After all, many of the loudest tomato detractors had vested interests in keeping foreign foods out of local markets. Tomatoes, native to the Americas, were deeply tied to colonial expansion. And for many, the less said about the New World, the better, especially if it was served in sauce. You turn a page in the journal. A clipping from a French paper dated 1747. Tomate, le fruit trader. The trader fruit. Below it, a woodcut illustration of a tomato looking vaguely smug beside a drooping skeleton. Subtle. In London, meanwhile, newspapers were publishing satirical poetry about red devils in the garden. A baroness reportedly fainted after being served tomato soup during a diplomatic dinner and later claimed to have been visually attacked by the scent. A dramatization, surely. But in the 18th century, dramatization was kind of the default. One particularly curious fringe figure, a German mystic named Ruprecht von Holzen, believed that tomatoes were a botanical trick sent by the devil to sow confusion between fruits and vegetables. He gave impassioned lectures in candlelit parlors, warning that the tomato's unwholesome roundness was a sign of divine imbalance. He was also deeply afraid of mirrors and reportedly ate only beige food, so, grain of salt. Still, it wasn't all fringe thinkers and powdered nobility fanning themselves at the sight of a salad. Among the common people, suspicion toward tomatoes trickled down more gently. You know, the way most prejudice does. You hear something enough times from someone who seems important and suddenly it just feels true. As you sit in that room, surrounded by pages of warnings and pencil sketches of what appear to be demonic tomato hybrids, you realize something oddly comforting. People have always been weird. Just exquisitely, enthusiastically weird. And sometimes, when enough weird people with powdered wigs agree that a vegetable is dangerous, history ends up taking notes. One more entry in the journal catches your eye. It's from a Paris apothecary, dated 1753. He writes of a patient, a young man, who claimed he had developed excessive dreams of sun-drenched gardens after eating tomatoes. He feared that his inner balance had been tilted toward vice. The apothecary's recommendation? Abstain from red foods, pray regularly, and inhale ground lavender daily. Honestly, not the worst advice. You close the journal and lean back in the chair. A breeze from the cracked window rustles the edge of an old broadsheet titled Tomatoes and the Decline of French Manners. It's not satire. You checked. It's easy to chuckle now, of course, but part of you wonders, in 300 years, what foods will our descendants laugh at us for fearing? Almonds? Artificial sweeteners? Whatever's lurking inside energy drinks. The house creaks as you rise and step back into the corridor. The walls here are lined with old portraits, many with little tomatoes painted discreetly in the background. You now realize. On a table near the stairs sits a fruit bowl, apples, pears, plums, but no tomatoes. They're still too scandalous for display. And yet, hidden away in journals and side dishes, tomato appreciation was quietly blooming. Somewhere in a back kitchen, a chef was roasting one over fire, just to see what might happen. Somewhere in a garden, a curious child was biting into a ripe one and discovering, gasp, it was delicious. But for now in this house the tomato remains a whisper. A warning. A wildly misunderstood fruit dressed up in fear and pewter poisoning and red-hued melancholy. And as the candles flicker low you realize, the louder someone shouts that something is dangerous, the more likely they're just afraid of what they don't understand. You make your way up the creaking staircase again, fingertips brushing the smooth wooden banister worn soft by generations of polite disapproval. At the top, the hallway is dim and still. Dust floats lazily in the air, catching the last peach-colored rays of sunset through the high dormer windows. It's the sort of quiet that feels thick, heavy with secrets, or maybe just sleep. A door near the end of the corridor stands ajar. You push it open. Inside is a study, clearly male-occupied, judging by the abundance of maps, tobacco tins, and the faint odor of ancient pipe smoke. A pair of wire spectacles rests on an open ledger, and beside it, a small, folded pamphlet catches your eye. It's printed on brittle, yellowing paper, and the title reads, La Pomme d'Amour, Romantic Fruit or Rural Menace. A love apple. That's what the French sometimes call tomatoes, pomme d'amour. A name that sounds like it belongs in a perfume ad or whispered confession, but here it is, accused of corrupting the countryside. You sit down in the cracked leather chair, careful not to disturb the orderly chaos of papers, and begin to read. This section of our sleepy little tale is all about the strange dual identity of the tomato in 18th century European thought. Because while many feared it, others began to eroticize it. Not in the overt sense, no scandalous still lives, but in the hushed, flustered way that only a fruit with a velvet red skin and juicy interior could inspire. You wouldn't know it from modern supermarket aisles, but the tomato once had a reputation for seduction. Its softness, its plumpness, its deep color, it was considered dangerously suggestive. The name love apple didn't help. Nor did the fact that some believed it could stir passion, particularly in women. Not that women were ever allowed to express that openly, of course, but the fear was there, quietly fueling whispered warnings and church frowns. Historians still argue whether this sensual association was widespread or mostly confined to certain urban salons and literary circles. Either way, tomato imagery started appearing in odd places: plays, poetry, herbal guides. In one cheeky satirical pamphlet from Naples, a tomato was described as a red-cheeked temptress that slinks between bread. Subtle? Not quite. You find another document tucked beneath the inkwell. A hand-copied recipe for a so-called aphrodisiacal salad. It includes arugula, vinegar, and, scandalously, a chopped tomato with the note, to be served only in secret, preferably after dusk. You stifle a chuckle. Nothing says passion like leafy greens and illicit fruit. You imagine the dining rooms of the time, candlelight flickering on pewter, soft music from a spinet in the next room, a faint sheen of perspiration on someone's brow, not from heat, but from wondering if they were about to eat a dish that would corrupt their soul and their digestion. There was even, at one point, a fringe belief that tomatoes might contain a sort of heat of the blood. In Italian folk medicine, the idea of hot and cold foods wasn't just metaphorical, it was part of a complex system of bodily balance. Tomatoes, being red, juicy, and prone to rapid spoilage, were placed firmly on the hot end of the scale, which meant they could provoke fever, lust, even madness. It's the kind of logic that feels almost poetic, if wildly incorrect. And then there were the gardens. Ah, the secret tomato gardens. By the late 1700s, small pockets of quiet tomato cultivation had popped up in aristocratic estates and monastery kitchens. These tomatoes weren't grown for meals, not openly, but as curiosities. As exotic plants to be observed, touched carefully, and perhaps admired a bit too long. There's a monastery in Bologna, for instance, where tomatoes were grown in a special walled garden, no cooking allowed, just careful observation, almost like a zoo for fruit. You wonder how many novice monks snuck a bite and waited in fear for their passions to go up in flames. Spoiler, none of them burst into flames. They probably just needed a glass of water. You walk to the window now, opening it just slightly. Cool air drifts in. Below, the garden glows under a rising moon. Somewhere, a night insect begins its high, sleepy drone. You rest your elbows on the windowsill and think about all the things humans have declared dangerous, simply because they didn't understand them, or worse because they did. Tomatoes weren't just feared because of pewter plates or questionable digestion. They were feared because they were vibrant, unfamiliar, juicy in all the wrong ways. They looked like something that could make you feel something. And in a society where feelings were best hidden under lace collars and polite silences, that made them dangerous indeed. You imagine an 18th century poet, sitting in a cramped Paris apartment, writing verses not about a woman's eyes but about the tomato on his windowsill. How it glowed like firelight. How it tempted him to taste, to risk everything, to feel something again. Then likely he folded the paper neatly and hid it under a floorboard before anyone could read it. Of course, not everyone was subtle. One pamphlet from London in 1762 featured a series of tomato-based metaphors so suggestive it was banned from polite society, and yet reprinted 3 times. Because let's be honest, if history teaches us anything, it's that even the prudes are curious. You lean back in the chair once more. The desk creaks softly beneath your weight, and outside the wind rustles the hedges. The tomato, it seems, lived a double life, feared in the dining hall, fantasized about in the shadows. And you? You're just the time-traveling guest who wandered into this strange, red-tinted love story by accident. Or maybe it was fate. After all, what better bedtime story than a tale of forbidden fruit, misunderstood passions, and very confused 18th century poets? The garden below is quieter now, silvered in moonlight, the scent of damp earth drifting lazily through the open window. You pull it closed with a soft click, the cool metal latch sliding into place like a punctuation mark. Then you turn, stepping away from the suggestive tomato desk, yes, that's what it's called now, and back into the hallway, which smells faintly of beeswax and something older. Not decay exactly, just time. Further down the corridor, another door yawns open. You step through. It's a kitchen. But not just any kitchen, this is the working heart of the manor. No polished silver or dainty pastries here. Instead, long wooden tables stained with decades of spices, tall shelves crammed with earthen jars, and a soot-darkened hearth wide enough to roast an entire pig. Which, judging by the hooks hanging overhead, they did regularly. This section isn't about fear or fantasy. It's about function. Because while the nobility whispered warnings about tomatoes in salons, downstairs in kitchens like this one, cooks were experimenting. Not always boldly. Not always successfully. But enough to start shifting the story. Here, in Section 8, you get to sink into the simmering, bubbling world of 18th century European cooking. And the very quiet culinary rebellion that began with just one brave cook and one overly ripe tomato. Let's start in Italy, Naples to be precise, where early tomato dishes began to appear despite widespread suspicion. While the upper classes wrinkled their noses, working-class Neapolitans had fewer illusions and far more incentive to make use of available ingredients. Tomatoes grew well in southern Italian soil and they were cheap, which, in food history, is often the first step toward ubiquity. One of the earliest mentions of tomatoes in actual recipes comes from a 1692 Neapolitan cookbook, Lo scalco alla moderna. It included a recipe for tomato sauce to be served over meat. Not pasta, not yet. Pasta wouldn't meet tomato in any widespread plate-worthy way until well into the 19th century. But the idea had begun to simmer. In Spain, too, early stews began to incorporate tomatoes. The sofrito, a blend of onions, garlic, olive oil, and tomato, started appearing in rustic kitchens, long before anyone dared serve it to a nobleman. Historians still debate whether these early uses were born out of desperation or innovation. Either way, the tomato was carving out a place not on the banquet table, but in the back kitchen, where the rules were softer and the palates more practical. You reach for a jar of dried herbs on the shelf and open the lid. The scent is strong green dusty. Thyme maybe. Or marjoram. Beneath it, you find a handwritten recipe card, the ink faded but legible. It reads, "Stew for the cold months, add 2 tomatoes if no one is looking." You smile. It's a quiet rebellion, isn't it? Not with swords or speeches but with sauce. Even in France, where tomatoes were viewed with more suspicion than a stranger in untied breeches, some rural cooks began to sneak them into vegetable soups. There's a diary entry from a housemaid in Bordeaux who confessed to using the little red fruits in a broth she served to her employer, who complimented the taste, but asked that it never be repeated. Too rich, he said. Too foreign. It wasn't just about flavor either. Cooks quickly noticed how tomatoes changed the color of food. A bland beige stew could suddenly become deep crimson. A splash of tomato turned an anemic broth into something bold, almost theatrical. That kind of transformation, even subtle, made a dish feel alive. Like it had a story to tell. You open the oven door out of curiosity. Cold now, but you can still smell the ghosts of roasted meat, ash, and maybe, just maybe, the sharp sweet tang of something else. Something red. One curious cook in Vienna began adding tomatoes to his cabbage dishes, hoping to mellow the bitterness. The resulting dish horrified his employer, who claimed the acid fruit had poisoned the Christian balance of the plate. Strong words for a side dish. And yet, these culinary experiments didn't stop. In taverns and boarding houses, travelers began to develop a taste for tomato-spiked sauces and relishes. Soldiers, especially those stationed in Italy or Spain, brought home stories of bold flavors and fiery stews, served with rustic bread and laughter. Many of them likely couldn't pronounce Solanum lycopersicum, but they knew a good meal when they tasted one. Back in this kitchen, you spot a small basket tucked under the table. Inside, nestled among onions and parsnips, are 3 tomatoes. Slightly bruised. Slightly defiant. Someone here has been cooking with them. You take one in your hand. It's warm from the ambient heat of the hearth, its skin slightly wrinkled. You imagine it bubbling down in a copper pot, mixing with garlic, maybe a little wine, a bay leaf floating lazily on top like a ship sailing into the future of food. Because that's what this is, isn't it? The tomato's redemption arc starts not in salons or apothecaries, but in kitchens like this one, where the rules could bend, where taste mattered more than theory, where fear took a backseat to hunger, and flavor had the final word. Of course, change was slow. For decades, tomatoes remained stuck in the gap between superstition and acceptance. Too new for trust, too tasty to ignore. But in that gap, something beautiful began to cook. Quietly, gently, one simmering pot at a time. And as you set the tomato back in its basket and step toward the door, you feel it. Not just the hunger in your belly, but the faint, warm promise of revolution. Not all revolutions shout. Some bubble. The kitchen door swings closed behind you with a soft thud, the scent of herbs and slow-cooked history still clinging to your clothes. You move down a narrow staircase now, one that leads not upward into the grand halls of power, but downward, into the cellars, storerooms, and pantries of public opinion. Because for all the sauces bubbling in secret and the poems penned in private, there was one looming presence that could not be avoided: the press. This part of our sleepy tale, the one you're walking into now, belongs to the pamphleteers, the gossipers, the pamphlets that fluttered through markets like startled birds, shouting opinions in thick serif fonts. Welcome to the world of tomato propaganda. You find yourself in a cluttered study once more, but this one is different from the monk's cell or the aristocrat's desk. It's louder even in its silence. Inky fingerprints mark every surface, quills overflow from cracked mugs, and the walls are tacked with draft titles like a most unnatural fruit, and of witches' crops and red harvests. It smells like old paper, fresh ink, and deeply held opinions. You pick up a pamphlet at random. The year is 1743. The title reads, "The Italian Fruit and Its Moral Danger, a Warning to Mothers." And no, that's not a parody. That was a very real fear. This section is all about how the tomato became the scapegoat of 18th century media. Not because it actually did anything wrong, but because it was foreign, misunderstood, and just juicy enough to make a great headline. Historians still argue whether the moral panic around tomatoes was more performative than genuine. After all, the same society that published anti-tomato screeds was also quietly cultivating them in monastery gardens and slathering them over veal. But the printed word had power, and for many, fear began on the page. One London paper in 1751 ran an article claiming that tomatoes caused boiling of the blood and unspeakable urges in the fairer sex. Another pamphlet insisted that tomatoes were linked to declining church attendance, because apparently, nothing tempts a good Christian away from the pulpit like a salad. Of course, these claims were rarely backed by any real evidence. But they didn't need to be. They played to the anxieties of a society in flux. Urbanization, immigration, changing diets, scientific breakthroughs, everything felt unstable. And into that storm rolled the tomato, a little red fruit with a funny name and no known ancestors in scripture. You turn the page of a particularly dramatic broadside to find a hand-drawn illustration of a tomato vine entangling a man's legs while a woman faints nearby. Subtle it is not. Then there's the French satire, which operated on a different wavelength. In Paris, where irony was practically a breakfast condiment, writers embraced the absurd. One mocked-up court transcript accused a tomato of seducing a nobleman's wife and stealing silver from the pantry. Another poem described the red villain as both fruit and fraud, soft-fleshed and full of schemes. You can't help but laugh. Even 250 years ago, people loved a good food scandal. But beneath the jokes and the outrage lay real consequences. Public perception shifted. Farmers who once experimented with tomato crops began to pull them up out of fear that buyers would flee. A merchant in Brussels was forced to shutter his stall after a rival spread rumors that his tomatoes whispered foreign curses when sliced. One particularly strange English pamphlet from 1778 made the rounds with the title, Against the Cult of Crimson, a treatise on the unwholesome fruit. Inside, it claimed that tomatoes caused everything from dreams of rebellion to night sweats of the French persuasion. Whatever that means. Of course, not all the press was negative. Some early Enlightenment thinkers, particularly those aligned with agricultural reform, tried to shift the narrative. They published essays touting the tomato's hardiness, its nutritional value, and its potential to feed the poor. But in a world addicted to scandal, reasoned argument often took a back seat. You pause by a shelf crammed with typed cases, tiny lead letters still in neat rows. You imagine the printers working by candlelight, the clink of type, the scratch of quill on draft, the hot breath of rumor rolling off the press. One pamphlet catches your eye, The Gentleman's Companion, a guide to gardening and gallantry. Inside is a chapter on how to discreetly grow tomatoes, rebranded here as Mediterranean pears, without attracting the judgment of your neighbors. A note in the margin reads, Tell guests they're decorative. Never admit to tasting. And it wasn't just the general public being swayed. City councils and town magistrates sometimes weighed in. In parts of northern Germany, ordinances warned against the open peddling of foreign red fruits. In Lisbon, tomatoes were briefly classified as ornamental rather than edible, essentially banning them from markets while allowing them in gardens. It was the bureaucracy's version of a wink. You sigh and sink into a nearby armchair. It wheezes beneath your weight but offers comfort nonetheless. The fire crackles softly in the hearth, illuminating the room in amber light. You glance at the ceiling, half expecting to find tomato vines climbing the rafters in defiance. It's fascinating, really, how humans project so much meaning onto the things we eat. The tomato wasn't just food. It was politics, identity, fear of change wrapped in a glossy red skin. It made people nervous because it wasn't easily categorized. Not quite fruit, not quite vegetable. From the new world but growing in the old. A culinary wild card. And as you close the last pamphlet and place it gently on the desk, you can't help but smile. Because despite the headlines, the rumors, the doctored illustrations, the tomato was still here. Still growing. Still waiting patiently for its comeback. In a way, it's the perfect underdog. Juicy. Misunderstood. And just stubborn enough to outlive the hate. The armchair groans politely as you rise, leaving behind the ink-smudged trail of gossip and misinformation. You step quietly out of the pamphleteer's study, your footsteps muffled on thick rugs woven with tired florals. A hallway curves ahead like a question mark, dimly lit, and at its end, there it is. A door labeled in curling script, the apothecary's parlor. You push it open and inhale immediately, clove, vinegar, dried orange peel, something sweet and something sinister. This is where our sleepy story turns medicinal. Tonight, we step into the powder-dusted world of 18th century apothecaries, those curious hybrids of pharmacist, herbalist, and rumor sponge. And yes, in this room the tomato had a chapter too. You run your fingers across a marble countertop littered with tiny brass scales, vials sealed with wax, and a pestle resting heavily in a worn mortar. On a nearby shelf, labeled neatly in Latin, is a jar that reads, Solanum lycopersicum, indeterminate use. That about sums it up. Because while some doctors and chemists were terrified of the tomato, others, fringe thinkers and botanical enthusiasts, saw potential. In a century before germ theory, medicine was part science, part guesswork, and part faith. If it grew in the ground and didn't immediately kill someone, someone somewhere would try to use it to cure something. Tomatoes were believed by some to purify the blood. Others thought they induced vomiting, which, stay with me, was often seen as a positive medical outcome back then. One charming theory argued that since tomatoes were acidic, they might burn away melancholy. A tasty cure for sadness? Historians still debate whether this was earnest or just an early attempt at branding. In Italy, where tomatoes had crept further into acceptance, herbalists began recommending tomato juice as a treatment for indigestion, especially after heavy meats. It was also pressed and mixed with vinegar for treating sore gums, and occasionally mashed into a paste for, of all things, sunburn. Imagine slathering your shoulders with tomato pulp after a long day in the sun. Your neighbors might not understand, but your skin might thank you. You lean over a thick ledger resting on a stool, the pages crinkled with time. It's an apothecary's record from 1772 Vienna. Tomato extract appears 4 times, always listed alongside cautious dosage, and non-noble patients only. That's code for poor folks, often test subjects by default. The elite had the luxury of skepticism. Everyone else had to improvise. Then there's the case of Dr. William Salmon, a rather bold English physician who, in 1710, wrote that tomatoes could be used for the cooling of the liver and the washing of internal heat. What exactly he meant by internal heat is unclear, but scholars suspect it could refer to inflammation, fever, or maybe just being really cranky in August. Still, the tomato's presence in medicine remained controversial. Some apothecaries refused to stock it, claiming it was more likely to unsettle the bile than balance it. Others whispered that the fruit belonged to the nightshade family, alongside belladonna and deadly henbane, and should be handled with gloves and suspicion. You pause beside a tall cabinet with glass doors. Inside are neat rows of tiny bottles labeled in multiple languages, French, Latin, Arabic. It's a quiet reminder of how global medicine already was, even centuries ago. Trade routes had blurred borders. A Chinese rhubarb root sat beside a Moroccan mint extract. And tucked away, humble and slightly dusty, a bottle simply marked tomato ilex. The cork is cracked. You resist the urge to sniff it. In America, by the late 1700s, tomatoes had started to gain a medical following too. One particularly enthusiastic figure was Dr. John Cook Bennett, who in the early 19th century, would later claim that tomatoes could cure diarrhea, dyspepsia, and even cholera. He was so convinced of the tomato's power that he began marketing tomato pills, though some critics accused him of using the fruit more as a marketing tool than an actual ingredient. Back in Europe, though, the tomato lingered in limbo, neither fully condemned nor fully embraced. In medical texts it was a footnote. In households a curiosity. And in this apothecary's room, a symbol of how complicated healing can be when fear gets in the way. Historians still debate whether the tomato's slow medical adoption was due to its appearance, its lineage, or simply the fact that it didn't do anything miraculous. It didn't numb pain like opium. It didn't purge the system like rhubarb. It didn't dazzle. It just existed. And yet, in a field crowded with toad powder, mercury tinctures and recipes involving crushed pearls, maybe existing without harm was already a step ahead. You settle onto a wooden bench by the window, the night air creeping in with a sigh. In the distance a dog barks once. Then silence. The tomato's medicinal journey may not have been glamorous, but it was real. In its own quiet way, it challenged the gatekeepers of health and wellness, not by conquering disease but by enduring skepticism. And really that's a kind of healing too, isn't it? You rise again and gently close the apothecary's door behind you. The corridor ahead is darker now, the lanterns low, the shadows soft. But you carry the faint smell of herbs and history with you, and a new appreciation for the fruit that was almost a medicine. Almost a monster. Almost forgotten. Almost. You step into another room now, this one lined not with shelves or vials, but windows, tall panes of glass looking out over a lush, geometrically perfect garden. The moonlight glances off gravel paths and clipped box hedges, and just beyond them, you spot what you've been waiting for: tomatoes. Rows and rows of them, ripening gently in raised beds and wooden planters. Welcome to the hidden world of aristocratic gardens. Because while pamphlets shrieked warnings and apothecaries debated extracts, wealthy Europeans were doing what they'd always done, trying to outdo each other in style. And for a time in the 18th century, tomatoes were not so much food as they were fashionable foliage. You stroll along a stone path now, your shoes crunching softly beneath you. It's surprisingly peaceful out here, almost like the tomatoes themselves have chosen to lie low, content to let the rest of Europe argue about their destiny. Historians still argue whether aristocrats truly embraced tomatoes for eating or simply for showing off. Many estate records list Solanum lycopersicum in their garden inventories, often alongside pineapples, asparagus and other high-maintenance produce. Yet few menus from these same households mention tomatoes being served. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the tomato was treated more like an exotic pet than a pantry item. You pause beside a marble bench carved with the crest of some long-dead noble family. Just beyond it, a gardener tends to a tall stake tomato plant, snipping off the lower leaves with almost priestly reverence. He probably knows not to eat them. But he also knows how to keep them alive, and beautiful. That was the tomato's new role in the 1760s and 1770s, an ornamental oddity. It looked strange enough to impress guests, required enough effort to make you feel clever, and, most importantly, was rare enough to spark envy. Think of it as the botanical version of a sports car. In England, aristocrats began commissioning hot walls, brick structures designed to retain heat, so tender plants like tomatoes could thrive in chilly climates. They imported seeds from Italy and hired specialists to build glasshouses. One lord in Sussex even hired an Italian fruit steward solely to manage his tomato vines. The tomatoes were rarely eaten. But when guests visited, they were shown the vines with much ceremony, often while sipping tea and pretending to understand Latin. It became something of a trend to rename tomato varieties with grand titles. One wealthy estate in France grew a cultivar called La Gloire d'Italie. Another favored Pomme d'amour or love apple, even though no one was entirely clear on what love had to do with it. It was just French enough to sound fancy. You stop beneath an arched trellis woven with trailing vines. Overhead, a single tomato dangles like a ruby in the moonlight. It's oddly elegant. And maybe that's why it stuck around, because despite all the fear, the tomato never stopped being beautiful. In Austria, Empress Maria Theresa had tomato vines grown in palace gardens, not for eating but as conversation pieces. Visitors recorded seeing the strange red bulbs hanging beside roses and cypress trees. One diplomat from Sweden wrote in his journal, "They are not to be eaten but they please the eye." A bit like court musicians. And even though tomatoes still hadn't won over most dining rooms, they were creeping into the periphery. Paintings from the late 1700s begin to show them tucked into fruit baskets, often beside grapes and peaches. One Italian portrait includes a tomato nestled near a noblewoman's hand, though art historians still debate whether it was symbolic of passion or just an excuse to show off horticultural knowledge. You stroll farther down the path now, your fingertips brushing soft tomato leaves. They smell unmistakable, green, peppery, earthy. Not everyone likes that smell. Some found it suspicious. One garden journal from 1779 suggested wearing gloves when handling tomato vines, to avoid their sedative vapors. A bit dramatic but not uncommon. You reach a greenhouse at the far end of the garden. Inside, the air is thick and warm, and rows of tomato plants stretch toward the ceiling, supported by wooden frames and patient hands. This is where the real care happens. Gardeners nurturing plants like rare books, trimming and watering and watching, waiting for color to bloom. It's easy to forget, as you stand here in this glass cathedral of leaves, that these plants were once feared as demonic, then mocked as lustful, then passed over as useless. Yet here they are, cultivated with devotion and money and time. Historians still debate whether this aristocratic embrace of tomatoes helped pave the way for their culinary redemption. Some argue it softened public perception. Others believe it delayed the tomato's acceptance as food by turning it into an elite toy. Either way, these gardens mattered. They kept tomatoes alive during decades of distrust. They preserved varieties. They built the infrastructure, the greenhouses, the seed trades, the networks, that would later serve cooks and farmers alike. You pause by one last plant before leaving. It's smaller than the others, tucked in a clay pot with a hand-lettered sign, Varietas Incognita. Unknown variety. You smile. Fitting. Because the tomato of the 18th century is still a mystery. feared and loved, avoided and adored, a riddle rooted in dirt. You step back onto the gravel path and let the garden fade behind you. The windows of the great house flicker in the distance. The tomato has not yet won its place at the table, but it's inching closer, leaf by leaf, vine by vine. And as the wind stirs the plants behind you, it almost sounds like a whisper, "Just wait. You'll see." The manor disappears behind you as you wander into a quieter lane, a dusty village road framed by thatched roofs and sleepy shutters. You pass a baker's window still warm with the smell of rye, a cobbler's shop with boots dangling like tired fruit, and finally what you're here for, a market square. This is where the tomato's fate really starts to wobble. No aristocratic fences here. No carefully labeled varieties in silver pots. Just vendors and vegetables and the rhythm of real life. And for a while in the 18th century the tomato had no place in it. You stroll past wicker baskets brimming with onions, beets, wrinkled apples, and a heap of cabbages looking more like old wigs than food. No tomatoes. Not yet. A merchant dozing on a stool might blink awake if you asked for them, then mutter, "Don't carry those. Bad luck." Because here, among people who didn't own hot walls or silk cravats, the tomato wasn't misunderstood, it was ignored. It wasn't medicine. It wasn't decoration. It was just a risky thing rich folks toyed with. And villagers had enough risks already. But somewhere around the 1760s things started to shift. You spot a little stand tucked near the well, half hidden under a frayed tarp. And there, finally, a few rough, slightly bruised tomatoes in a wooden bowl. They don't look proud. They look apologetic. Like they've shown up late to a party they weren't sure they were invited to. These tomatoes are here because of two things: hunger and immigrants. Southern European migrants, especially Italians and Spaniards, were already used to tomatoes. In Naples, tomatoes had been stewed and spooned over pasta since the late 1600s. In Provence they were stuffed with breadcrumbs and herbs. These people brought seeds and memories with them. And when they settled in market towns or took jobs as cooks in wealthy homes, the tomato quietly hitched a ride. Historians still debate whether early tomato dishes served in England and northern France were adaptations of Mediterranean recipes or entirely new creations. But evidence points to hybrids, spiced tomato sauces showing up in cookbooks around 1770, often buried deep in chapters titled, "Concerning Sauces of Uncertain Use." You reach into the wooden bowl now and pick up one of the tomatoes. It's not perfectly round. A little split near the top, a bruise on one side. But there's a warmth to it, the kind of humble, edible potential that says, "I may not be noble but I'll feed you." And that mattered. Because as the Industrial Revolution crept closer, food shortages became more common. Crops failed. Wages dropped. And suddenly, anything that could grow quickly, in small plots and with minimal fuss was valuable. Tomatoes had been waiting for this. You duck into a nearby kitchen, dimly lit, soot-smudged and rich with the smell of simmering something. A cook stirs a pot with a bent spoon. Beside her on the table, a cutting board, a handful of garlic, some leftover lamb, and a single chopped tomato. You watch her toss it in without ceremony. The pot hisses. The sauce darkens. This is how it begins, not with fanfare but with necessity. By the late 1700s, tomato use among working-class cooks was spreading. Not always in grand dishes. Sometimes it was a spoonful stirred into stew, or mashed with salt and vinegar as a fish marinade. It was a hint of acidity where none existed before. A little color in a gray season. And while elite food writers largely ignored this shift, travelers began to notice. One Swedish visitor to Portugal in 1784 wrote of a peasant meal of fish cooked with those curious red fruits, sour and soft. He didn't like it, but he remembered it. You glance around the kitchen. It's nothing like the manor house. No velvet drapes. No footmen. Just cast iron, smoke and effort. But this is where the tomato was finally eaten with purpose. Still, resistance remained. In some towns, tomatoes were only used for animal feed. In others, local priests warned they were fruits of decay, or that their red flesh resembled the heart of the devil. Bit dramatic, but hey, it was a theatrical century. There's a record from a Yorkshire village in 1791 where a man was fined for encouraging the sale of foreign fruit known to incite humors. That foreign fruit? A tomato. Historians still argue whether the fine was really about tomatoes or if the man had simply annoyed someone on the parish council. Either way, tomatoes were still guilty by association. And yet, slowly they dug in. You leave the kitchen and return to the square, where a child now sits near the tomato stand, holding one in both hands like it might sing. She takes a bite. Juice dribbles down her chin. She doesn't flinch. just wipes her mouth with a sleeve and grins. She's not afraid. And neither are the people lining up now, 3, 4, 5 of them. Not for bouquets. Not for snake oil. For tomatoes. Lumpy, strange, almost bitter tomatoes. And that's enough. You move on as the market begins to quiet, baskets emptying, vendors packing up. The sun dips lower, casting everything in soft orange. And the tomato, against all odds, has started to belong. Not just in gardens. Not just in recipes. But in everyday hunger. And in that, perhaps, was its redemption. The evening deepens as you follow the cobblestone path out of the village, winding gently into farmland. The air smells like earth and hay, and there's a rustling hush all around, leaves shifting, insects buzzing sleepily, the faint echo of a dog barking somewhere far off. You pass fenced fields, chickens gossiping in their coops, and finally a farmhouse where smoke rises from a crooked chimney. This, you realize, is where the tomato truly found its future, the hands of farmers. While noblemen displayed them like trophies and cooks cautiously stirred them into stews, it was smallholder farmers who slowly, and often without fanfare, started cultivating tomatoes as a real crop. Not a curiosity. Not a hedge maze ornament. But food. You walk past rows of soil still warm from the day's sun. Here and there, tomato plants lean against stakes, their fruit at all stages, green, blushing, ripe. There's something deeply human about this scene. Familiar. Grounded. And it wasn't always this way. In much of northern Europe throughout the 1700s, tomatoes were tricky to grow. The climate didn't always cooperate. Frosts arrived early. Soil conditions varied. Plus, most farmers didn't want to waste land on something that might poison their family, or worse, simply not sell. But in southern regions like Italy, Spain, and parts of France, the tomato was already beginning to shift from exotic import to everyday staple. Farmers experimented with planting cycles, crossbreeding, and local adaptations. Some learned to dry tomatoes in the sun for preservation. Others cooked them into long-lasting pastes, early versions of what would one day become beloved sauces. Historians still argue whether the rise of tomato farming in Europe was driven more by immigrant labor or by market demand. Either way, by the 1790s, you start seeing tomato seed listings in agricultural manuals, quiet little footnotes at first, then full paragraphs. A tomato entry in a British gardening almanac from 1794 advises planting in rich soil with cautious optimism. Cautious optimism, probably the most British farming advice ever. You wander toward a barn where a farmer leans against a post, polishing a hoe with deliberate slowness. He nods when you glance at the tomato patch. Says nothing. Just gestures toward the plants like, yeah, they're coming along. Farmers are practical people. They may not care what doctors or noblemen think. Something grows well and sells modestly, it stays. And that's how the tomato won, not with parades or proclamations but with patient, repeated proof. It helped that tomatoes were resilient. Once they took root, they adapted quickly. Certain varieties could grow in shallow soil, others withstood high heat. They were surprisingly pest-resistant. And with a bit of luck, a single plant could yield dozens of fruits. The yield-to-space ratio was attractive. And when word spread that tomatoes could be used to flavor otherwise bland foods, like lentils or salted pork, they started to make culinary sense too. You peek inside the farmhouse kitchen where a pot bubbles on the stove. A tired woman stirs with one hand, nursing a baby with the other. There's a tomato sitting beside the breadboard, soft and ready. She slices it without looking, tosses it into the stew and moves on. No ritual. No fear. Just dinner. This is the tipping point. When tomatoes stop being a risk and start being routine. You can almost hear the quiet revolution in that single sleepy motion of the knife. And yet not everything was smooth. In colder regions, tomato growing remained a gamble well into the 19th century. British farmers relied on makeshift cloches, glass domes, to protect seedlings. Others started tomatoes indoors and prayed they'd survive the transplant. There are records of entire crops being wiped out by a sudden May frost, the farmer's journal entry reading simply, all lost. Sauce deferred. Meanwhile, in colonial outposts, tomatoes were faring better. Farmers in the Americas, India, and the Caribbean were growing them with less resistance. Spanish colonies especially embraced them, partly due to familiarity with New World plants, partly out of necessity. In fact, some of the best tomato cultivation knowledge in Europe came from these far-flung corners of empire. Agricultural journals began sharing tips from planters abroad, detailing irrigation methods and seed-saving tricks. Global tomato gossip, if you will. Still, back on European farms, tomatoes weren't beloved. They were tolerated. Useful. a seasonal oddity that might just fill out the soup. But slowly their presence became expected. You step into the barn and spot a seed box, carefully labeled. Inside, carrot, parsnip, barley, and at the back, tomato, red, mild. It's not front and center. It's not the star. But it's in there. It's part of the plan now. And once something's in the seed box, it's hard to get rid of. One farmer in rural Belgium wrote in 1798 that he didn't like the taste of tomatoes unless they're cooked into butter with garlic. He added, "They are ugly but they keep the bread from being lonely." I praise really. You sit down now on a hay bale watching the last light stretch across the fields. The tomato vines cast long shadows. Nothing flashy. Just a quiet plant that found its way into the lives of people who needed something that grew where little else would. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. And by the end of the century, across more and more farms, the tomato wasn't just growing. It was staying. The moon rises as you leave the farm behind, casting everything in silver and quiet. You follow a winding path that leads into a small port town. The sea is just visible on the horizon, its surface like crumpled silk. Ships sway in the harbor. Nets hang from poles like ghostly curtains. Somewhere, a gull complains sleepily. This is where the tomato takes to the waves. Because as the 18th century draws to a close, Europe begins exporting not just goods and guns, but recipes, seeds, and tastes. And the tomato, which once slinked into kitchens by backdoor necessity, now hitches a ride into the world's food imagination. But before we get to its global leap, there's one very unexpected place where the tomato made a kind of reputation for itself. You walk past the candlelit window of a rustic tavern. Inside, sailors play cards. A dog lies under the table. And on the bar, a bottle of thick red sauce labeled in curling script, tomato ketchup. Yes, ketchup. It didn't begin with tomatoes, of course. The original ketchup came from Southeast Asia, a fermented fish sauce that European traders encountered in the 1600s. They brought it home, then promptly changed everything. By the mid-1700s, British ketchup recipes were a strange parade of ingredients. Anchovies, walnuts, mushrooms, even oysters. Tomatoes joined the party late. But once they did, they stuck. You sit at the bar and watch the tavern keeper spoon a red dollop onto a trencher of salt beef. It's tangy, vinegary, a little sweet. He shrugs when you ask if it's popular. Keeps well. Makes things less awful. A fair review. By the early 1800s, tomato ketchup had become its own category, still debated, often homemade but undeniably present. Historians still argue whether the addition of tomatoes was inspired by colonial trade or local improvisation. But either way, tomato ketchup marks a turning point. Now the tomato isn't just tolerated. It's desired. And it's shelf-stable. You stroll toward the docks now, where crates are being loaded by moonlight. One crate labeled seeds, assorted, Naples. Another simply says Pomodoro. Inside, tomato seeds. Not for botanical gardens or experimental plots, but for farmers in other lands, India, the Caribbean, North Africa. The tomato is leaving home again. Except this time, it's carrying a suitcase full of credibility. Sailors, soldiers, and colonial administrators helped spread tomato dishes far and wide. A British officer in India noted in an 1803 diary that the tomato is a fine remedy against dull messes. And in the Caribbean, enslaved cooks used tomatoes in ingenious stews that would become precursors to Creole cuisine. You pass another tavern, quieter now. A plate sits abandoned on a table, a heel of bread smeared with something red. Evidence of a plant that had moved from poison to condiment, from suspicion to appetite. But not all opinions had changed. In Northern Europe, especially among older generations, tomatoes were still eyed with caution. Some cookbooks insisted on boiling them, no fewer than 2 hours to remove malice. One early 19th century cookbook warns, "Take care not to eat tomatoes raw lest the stomach be disturbed." Yet despite this, people were doing exactly that. You duck into a shadowy alley where two boys sit on crates, one slicing a tomato with a pocket knife. They sprinkle salt on it, trade bites, grin through the juice. No fanfare. No fear. And elsewhere, tomatoes were going further, into pies, sauces, roasted on skewers. In the American South, tomatoes were being fried in bacon fat and tucked into biscuits. In Mexico, they were already core to salsa recipes centuries old, now renewed with European varieties. It's a tomato loop, born in the Americas, feared in Europe, now returning home with a passport and a recipe book. You find yourself on a wharf now, watching a ship prepare to sail. Crates, barrels, sacks, and among them, small pots with tomato seedlings, wrapped in burlap and tied with string. carried by migrants who couldn't leave home without them. One woman fingers the leaves as if to reassure the plant. Or maybe herself. Because food is memory. And tomatoes had become just that. A memory of hardship. Of hunger. Of hard-won change. But also of survival. The kind of food you pass down in your stories or your soup. You sit on a coil of rope as the ship creaks and shudders into motion. The tomato isn't the main cargo. It's not the point of the voyage. But it's going. And that matters. Because from this moment forward, the tomato will stop being a curiosity and start becoming a staple. A little red fruit that outlived its reputation. The ship sails away, its lanterns glowing like sleepy stars on the black water. You remain at the edge of the dock, listening to the rhythmic hush of waves licking the shore. The smell of salt, damp rope and something faintly sweet, like overripe tomatoes, hangs in the air. And just like that, your journey with the tomato comes to its end. But not before one final detour. You rise and wander back through the quiet town. Most windows are dark now. The only shop still lit is a humble apothecary. You step inside. Shelves groan under the weight of jars, herbs, powders, snake oil. And there, among the quack cures and peculiar poultices, sits a bottle labeled, extract of tomato. Yes, tomato as medicine. After centuries of being accused of causing illness, the tomato was finally, and rather dramatically, promoted as a cure-all. By the early 1800s, just as tomatoes were gaining culinary acceptance, they began to earn a second life as a kind of health tonic. Tomato pills, pastes, powders, you name it, someone sold it. Many early American doctors especially swore by tomatoes as a natural cleanser of the bowels, and a general restorative. Mildly alarming? Absolutely. Did it work? Debatable. Historians still argue whether the tomato's medicinal reputation was born from honest observation or clever marketing. One theory suggests that since people who ate tomatoes often also ate fresh vegetables, a rarity in some areas, they naturally felt better, and the tomato took the credit. Another theory? Tomato-based laxatives were just effective. Very effective. You lift a bottle and read the faded label, guaranteed to purge the liver, uplift the mind and clarify the eyes. Not bad for a fruit that once allegedly liquefied noblemen. By the 1820s, tomato-based remedies were being sold in both Europe and the Americas. Farmers sold them alongside actual tomatoes at markets. One 1824 advertisement from Boston promotes Dr. Miles's tomato cure as a solution for everything from gout to melancholy. And it wasn't just pills. Tomato poultices, tomato soups for fever, even tomato lotions for female distress, were making the rounds. A French beauty manual insisted that tomato juice smoothed the skin and cheered the spirit. You peek behind the apothecary counter and spot a dusty book filled with tomato cures. It's half nonsense, half folklore and weirdly comforting. Like the tomato has finally come full circle, from threat to comfort food and now an improbable friend to the ill. But of course, its greatest healing power wasn't in its pulp or pectin. It was in the ritual of food itself. You exit the shop and stroll past a row of homes. From one you smell something rich and savory, garlic, onions, something bubbling. A sauce. You can almost hear it being stirred. Maybe it's a grandmother cooking late. Maybe it's just leftovers. But the scent is heavy with history. Because by now the tomato is no longer a scandal. It's dinner. And though it still raised eyebrows in parts of Britain, or among die-hard herbalists who refused to trust anything so red and so round, the tomato had finally become what it was always meant to be, part of the story. A story of fear that faded, of knowledge that evolved, of taste that won. As the 18th century closed, the tomato stood at the brink of superstardom. Not because of nobles or doctors or even farmers, but because of people. People who tasted, adapted and passed it on. People like you who once might have hesitated, and then taken a bite. You pause now beneath an archway draped in ivy, staring at the horizon where the sea meets the sky. The air is cool. The journey is over. But before you drift into the wind down, one last quirky fact to tuck under your pillow. By the 1830s, some American diners began offering free tomatoes at breakfast to help settle the stomach. A full circle moment for the fruit once blamed for stomach death. Not bad, tomato. Not bad at all. You're still now resting under a quilt of history and sea air. The night has softened around you, gentle and full. The lights of the harbor blink in slow rhythm, like the slow breathing of a world that's finally gone to sleep. The tomato, so small, so suspicious, so strangely powerful, fades into the quiet tapestry of the past. No longer feared. No longer whispered about in shadowy corners of courtly gardens. It is, at last, simply a part of life. A red gem in the pantry of human memory. Your feet are still dusty from the cobblestones. Your ears carry the echo of tavern laughter, the hum of crickets by tomato vines, the creak of ships preparing for sunrise voyages. And your thoughts drift like dandelion seeds, light, slow, untethered. There's something oddly soothing about the strange fears people once held. About how much we learn, how much we forget, how the world keeps spinning anyway. So let your body relax. Let your breath fall into that slow, even rhythm. The kind of rhythm that doesn't ask questions. That doesn't search for endings. Just drifts. Tonight, you've walked through superstition, through soil and sauce, through laughter and lore. And now, with the tomatoes safely planted in the world's kitchens, you have permission to rest. The journey is complete. Sleep well.